For 1,000 years, communism has not worked. Communism, or the concept of communism, has not worked. I tend to doubt it's going to work this time.
One word that would unravel everything Zohran Mamdani had built over months of careful political positioning. When Donald Trump looked directly into the camera and called Mamdani's defiant challenge dangerous, it wasn't just political commentary, it was a declaration of war. And in that war, Trump held all the weapons that mattered: federal funding, regulatory approval, and the power to make New York City's ambitious progressive agenda disappear with a single phone call. What happened in the 72 hours after that interview would expose just how fragile Mamdani's political revolution really was, and how quickly a mayor-elect could go from hero to beggar. The warning signs had been there for anyone paying attention. Behind the scenes at Mar-a-Lago, Trump's inner circle had been carefully studying Mamdani's victory speech, dissecting every word, every gesture, every tactical misstep. This guy thinks he can threaten the President of the United States. Stephen Miller had observed during a strategy session 3 days after the election. He has no idea what he's walking into. Trump himself had been initially amused by Mamdani's "turn the volume up" challenge, dismissing it as typical progressive posturing. But when he saw the full context, Mamdani's declaration that, to get to any of us, you will have to get through all of us, something shifted. The interview that would change everything was conducted at Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort on a sunny Tuesday morning. The setting was deliberately casual. Trump in his signature navy suit, sitting in the opulent living room that had become his unofficial Oval Office. But there was nothing casual about what he was planning to do to New York's new mayor. "You know, I'm so torn because I would like to see the new mayor do well because I love New York," Trump began, his voice carrying that deceptive warmth that preceded his most devastating attacks. "I really love New York. When I left New York for Washington, New York was doing really well, but there were some bad signs. The bad sign was a guy named de Blasio. So, the signs of de Blasio, that was the beginning, and it was bad. The setup was perfect." Trump was positioning himself as the reasonable elder statesman, the former president who genuinely cared about his home city's success. It made what came next even more brutal. For 1,000 years, communism has not worked. Communism, or the concept of communism, has not worked. I tend to doubt it's going to work this time. With those words, Trump had done something that would dominate news cycles for weeks. He had branded Mamdani, the mayor-elect of America's largest city, as a communist. Not a progressive, not a socialist, but a communist, a word that still carried the weight of decades of American political warfare. But Trump wasn't finished. When the interviewer asked about Mamdani's victory speech, Trump's assessment was surgical in its precision. "I thought it was a very angry speech. Certainly angry toward me. And I think he should be very nice to me. You know, I'm the one that sort of has to approve a lot of things coming to him, so he's off to a bad start." The threat was unmistakable, but delivered with Trump's characteristic blend of personal grievance and institutional power. The incoming mayor had insulted him, and now there would be consequences. Federal funding for infrastructure projects, disaster relief, transportation initiatives, all of it flowed through agencies controlled by the Trump administration. With a few strategic phone calls, Trump could make Mamdani's ambitious agenda financially impossible. The real moment of political devastation came when they played the clip of Mamdani's most defiant moment. "So hear me, President Trump, when I say this. To get to any of us, you will have to get through all of us." Trump's response was immediate and chilling. Very dangerous statement for him to make, actually. And you know, you talk about danger. I think it's a very dangerous statement for him to make. He has to be a little bit respectful of Washington, because if he's not, he doesn't have a chance of succeeding. The word dangerous hung in the air like a threat. Coming from the President of the United States, it wasn't just political criticism, it was an official assessment that could justify extraordinary measures. FBI investigations, IRS audits, federal regulatory crackdowns. All of these became possibilities once Trump had labeled Mamdani and his movement as dangerous. But it was Trump's final twist that revealed the true genius of his counterattack. "I want to make him succeed. I want to make the city succeed." By positioning himself as the reasonable party who wanted New York to thrive, Trump had made Mamdani look like the irrational aggressor whose pride was standing in the way of practical governance. When asked if he would reach out to Mamdani, Trump's response was a masterclass in power dynamics. I would say he should reach out to us. With that simple reversal, Trump had transformed Mamdani from a victorious progressive champion into a supplicant who needed to beg for federal support. The mayor, who had promised to turn the volume up, was now being told to turn it down or face the consequences. The reaction in New York was immediate and catastrophic. Within hours of the interview airing, Mamdani's transition team was in crisis mode. The federal funding that his ambitious agenda depended on $2.8 billion for infrastructure, $1.4 billion for affordable housing, $900 million for climate resilience projects, was suddenly in jeopardy. Transition advisors who had been celebrating just days earlier were now frantically calling contacts in Washington, trying to assess the damage and find ways to walk back Mamdani's rhetoric without appearing to capitulate. The financial markets reacted even faster. New York municipal bonds dropped 3% in afternoon trading as investors suddenly worried about the city's ability to finance its operations without federal support. Construction companies with major city contracts saw their stock prices plummet as analysts questioned whether promised infrastructure projects would move forward. Real estate developers who had been betting on Mamdani's housing initiatives began quietly lobbying for meetings with Trump administration officials. But the most devastating reaction came from New York City's own business community. Within 24 hours of Trump's interview, 3 major corporations announced they were reassessing their expansion plans in the city. The CEO of a Fortune 500 company that had planned to relocate its headquarters to Lower Manhattan issued a statement expressing concern about the uncertain federal-local relationship and announcing a 6-month delay in the move. Behind closed doors, panic was setting in among Mamdani's supporters. Union leaders who had enthusiastically backed his candidacy were suddenly questioning whether their members' jobs were secure if federal construction projects disappeared. Progressive activists who had celebrated his victory were beginning to understand that revolutionary rhetoric was meaningless without the resources to implement revolutionary policies. The most dramatic moment came during an emergency meeting at City Hall 2 days after Trump's interview. Mamdani sat at the head of a conference table surrounded by his top advisors, budget analysts, and department heads. The numbers they were presenting painted a stark picture. Without federal funding, nearly 40% of his campaign promises would be financially impossible to fulfill. Mr. Mayor-elect, his budget director said carefully, if we lose the federal transportation funding alone, we'll have to lay off 3,000 MTA workers within 6 months. The housing initiatives would be reduced by 70%. The climate projects would essentially disappear. The room was silent as the implications sank in. Mamdani, who had built his campaign on being uncompromisingly progressive, was being forced to confront a brutal reality. In America's federal system, even the most powerful local official was dependent on Washington's goodwill. The political establishment that had opposed Mamdani was quick to capitalize on his suddenly weakened position. Former Mayor Bloomberg issued a carefully worded statement expressing hope that all parties would prioritize New York's interests over political posturing. Governor Hochul, who had maintained careful neutrality during the election, began publicly emphasizing the importance of federal-state partnerships in achieving policy goals. City council members who had reluctantly endorsed Mamdani started distancing themselves from his more confrontational rhetoric. Conservative media, meanwhile, was having a field day. Fox News ran continuous coverage of what they dubbed the Mamdani meltdown, featuring panels of experts explaining how Trump had masterfully handled the challenge from New York's radical mayor. Right-wing podcasters played clips of Mamdani's defiant speech alongside Trump's measured response, highlighting the contrast between revolutionary bluster and practical power. The most damaging coverage came from an unexpected source: mainstream Democratic politicians who began publicly questioning Mamdani's political judgment. A senior Democratic congressman from New York told CNN that the mayor-elect had unnecessarily antagonized the president and created unforced errors that would hurt the city's residents. Several prominent liberal commentators wrote op-eds arguing that effective progressive governance required strategic thinking, not just moral posturing. But perhaps the most revealing reaction came from within Mamdani's own coalition. 3 days after Trump's interview, a group of progressive activists who had been instrumental in his campaign published an open letter calling for strategic recalibration while maintaining support for his policy agenda. They urged him to Engage constructively with federal authorities and avoid rhetoric that could undermine our shared goals. The letter was a devastating blow because it came from Mamdani's own base. The very activists who had celebrated his willingness to speak truth to power were now asking him to tone it down in the face of real political consequences. It was a stark reminder that revolutionary movements often crumble when they encounter actual power rather than just the idea of power. Behind the scenes, Mamdani's advisors were desperately trying to find a face-saving way to reach out to the Trump administration without appearing to grovel. Informal back-channel communications were established through mutual contacts, feeling out whether there was room for negotiation. The responses from Washington were not encouraging. Trump's people made it clear that any dialogue would require Mamdani to publicly acknowledge his mistake and commit to more respectful engagement going forward. The crisis deepened when economic data revealed the human cost of the federal city standoff. A preliminary analysis by the city's independent budget office showed that if federal funding was reduced by even 25%, unemployment in New York would increase by an estimated 50,000 jobs. Construction workers, teachers, social workers, and infrastructure maintenance crews would all face layoffs. The very working-class communities that had voted for Mamdani would bear the brunt of his confrontational approach. By the end of the week, the political equation had completely changed. Mamdani, who had seemed invincible just days after his election victory, was now trapped between his revolutionary promises and practical governance needs. His allies were abandoning ship, his opponents were emboldened, and his agenda was in ruins. The mayor, who had promised to turn the volume up, had been effectively muted by a former president who understood that in American politics, money talks louder than ideology. The transformation was symbolized by a hastily scheduled press conference where Mamdani announced his commitment to productive dialogue with all levels of government. Standing at the same podium where he had delivered his defiant victory speech, he now spoke in measured tones about practical solutions and collaborative governance. The revolutionary had become a technocrat. The rebel had become a supplicant. Trump's response to Mamdani's olive branch was swift and telling. A brief statement expressing willingness to work with officials who recognize the importance of respectful partnership. The subtext was clear. Mamdani had been broken, and now he would have to earn his way back into federal good graces through demonstrated compliance. The lesson was brutal but unmistakable. In American politics, institutional power trumps popular mandate every time. Mamdani had won an election, but Trump controlled the levers that actually made government function. The mayor could promise revolution, but the president could make those promises impossible to keep. What had started as Mamdani's moment of triumph had become a masterclass in how quickly political momentum can shift. One word, dangerous, had transformed a progressive champion into a cautionary tale about the limits of confrontational politics. The mayor, who had challenged Trump to turn the volume up, had learned that sometimes the most powerful response is to simply turn off the microphone entirely. And in New York City, as federal funding dried up and job losses mounted, residents were beginning to understand that their mayor's revolution would be paid for with their livelihoods. The panic that had started in transition offices was spreading to ordinary families who were discovering that political theater, however satisfying, was a luxury their city couldn't afford. The final irony was perfect in its cruelty. Mamdani had positioned himself as the voice of working people against elite power, only to discover that elite power had weapons he couldn't match, and working people would pay the price for his miscalculation. In trying to humble Trump, he had humbled only himself, and New York City would spend the next 4 years living with the consequences.